Welcome, Legionnaires, to the Long Live the Legion podcast, where we talk about the Legion of Superheroes comic book team and break subjects down so that whether you're just out of Legion Academy or you're a longtime veteran, you get to know the team a little bit better. I'm your co-host, Jim.
I'm your co-host, Jay.
And welcome to episode number 6. What do we have on the mission monitor board for today's episode, Jay?
Today is all Silver Age. We're going to break down the Silver Age Legion. We're going to talk about what a lot of Legion fans consider the best time in Legion history. And I'm going to guess that I'm going to say a bunch of stuff that's going to offend most of those fans.
So we're going back to the 60s, is what I'm hearing.
Back to the 60s.
All right. So, well, let's before we start getting into that aspect of things, what is the Silver Age? So for people who aren't even familiar.
Great question. So the Silver Age is basically the period of comics from 1956 to 1970. And the idea is it's when comics changed from what we had seen in the 40s and early 50s. The heroes start changing. So in the case of DC, we get a new Superman, new Batman. We get Justice League instead of Justice Society. In the case of Marvel, it's the complete change when Stan Lee and Jack Kirby take over, and Steve Ditko as well, and we get Spider-Man and Fantastic Four and the Avengers and characters like that. For the Legion, it's 1958, which is when they first appear in Adventure Comics, up until we're going to end this at the very end of their run in Action Comics. So it's 1970, mid 1970 is when this ends.
Awesome. So yeah, basically we're talking about that era in the American past where it's very much that American graffiti kind of style with regards to our culture and how everybody interacted and consumed media and things like that. So you have these, if any of the listeners are familiar with the show Happy Days, that kind of vibe where you had people going to the diner or the ice cream parlor and just hanging out and kind of killing time with your friends, but and not doing anything much. But this weird sense of kind of clean cut Americana, I guess, is kind of what I think of when I think of the Silver Age in comic books.
I tend to think in terms of it's post World War II, so America is at its they're rebuilding, and there's this period of success for the country, and I think most of the entertainment kind of shows that. And then for me, what's most fascinating about the Silver Age is as the counterculture starts to come in, and you can sort of see, in the beginning of the Silver Age, everything's very much like this idyllic, everything's perfect. And then you start seeing what's actually happening in the United States in the late 60s pop up. And it even pops up in the Legion of Superheroes, which is a fascinating read. So that's kind of what I think of when I think Silver Age.
Another thing that I was thinking too, when you were talking about that, was the visual storytelling mechanism of what the future looked like. So this time period is also pre-Star Trek, right? And I think for a lot of us, or for a lot of science fiction fans anyway, there's a big turning point in the 60s when you get everything before Star Trek, where you had this very much a Flash Gordon retro kind of this retro feel to it, where everything was in these rocket ships that everyone would fly around in, which is what we see with the Legion, in fact, and jetpacks and things like that, versus this post Star Trek era, which are these very sleek, interesting looking ships that just have a very, very different vibe. And in fact, the Legion, when we get into that era, that science fiction look also kind of changes more to that aesthetic as well. But that was the other thing that I thought of as well, that there's also a big kind of a Flash Gordon component to it, visually speaking anyway.
Right, like every ship has those fins on it.
Right, exactly right.
Right, so you've got to have the fins, and the costumes all have sort of the same styling to it. And I'm glad you pulled up. You mentioned Flash Gordon. He is definitely, and those strips are definitely a lot of the influence here. The robots are all these gigantic, clunky, boxy structures, but then they'll also just go, and then we have androids that look like people, and you can see a lot of the movie influences in what they're doing.
Oh, very much so. Very much so. I mean, in fact, I think it's safe to say that a lot of the Legion's look and feel, and even sometimes even direct stories, are captured from whatever the sci-fi popular thing was at the time, and then just kind of a few months later inserted into the stories somehow.
Exactly. The other thing I always like to mention when we talk Silver Age is the distribution and how ubiquitous this is in not only American culture, but I'd say, I mean, me being from Canada, Canadian culture as well. So DC is producing a bunch of comics that are literally distributing what we would say like 10 times what they're doing today. So these books are everywhere. They're in every corner store. They're in every. You see them in gas stations. You'll hear people talk about spinner racks. The idea of these metal structures where they put all the comics on it, and you can spin it around, and you can pick which one you want. They're also selling for what, like 10 cents, 12 cents. So these are disposable media. So they are written with the idea of like you're going to read them once, and you're probably going to toss them in the garbage. And the other big part of this is these are being produced for a predominantly, I don't want to say childish, but they're being produced for children. Like, I think the idea behind this is we're writing comics for 8-year-olds, for 9-year-olds. Like, these are not the comics of today. So
Yeah.
as you're reading over this, especially, and as we're talking about this, we always have to keep in mind, like, there's not a lot of depth to these stories. There's not a lot of continuity because they're not thinking about this has to tie into next issue, or we have to make sure this makes sense compared to what we published 6 months ago, because the assumption is the person might not have read that. So it's a very different writing style. It's a very different way of producing comics.
Well, I think Edwin Hamilton should have known that people in 2025 were going to be reading his books, and he should have accounted for all of that stuff. That's just my opinion.
I always keep going this whenever I write these whenever I do these rereads and I write these articles and I talk about this. I always have to keep reminding myself of the idea that like these guys are literally on this time deadline of we have to produce 24 pages in a month. It has to go out quick, and we're not worried about tons of stuff that a modern writer or a modern artist has to work about or worry about. Sorry. The joke that I always use, and it's a line, I forget which comedian said it, like, these books have the range of a Daisy air rifle. Like, there's no depth to this in the slightest, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So we have to kind of...
I was just going to say, the other thing that popped into my head when you were mentioning that, about the kind of what the books were intended for, who the audience was, all that stuff, was that you also had a much larger female audience at that time in the 50s and the 60s. They made comic books not just mainly for boys, right? Which is really kind of what the industry has turned into, or definitely turned into in the 70s, 80s, 90s. But in the 50s and 60s, they had all kinds of comics for women, for girls to be able to consume, whether it's, adventure or romance or what have you. I mean, they had an actual market for girls from a comic book perspective. And that's kind of what makes the Legion interesting, because they have so many female members, as we've talked about with Saturn Girl before. Yeah,
it's definitely a book that's aimed at a much bigger audience than I think a lot of books are today. And I agree, like it's so, I remember like thinking how weird it was when I first got into comics in the 1980s, and people would talk about like Jack Kirby starting on like a romance comic, and my brain kind of like broke a little bit, and I was like, really? Like, they made this? And yeah, back in the 50s and 60s, like, there were comics for everything. And in fact, like, war comics were in a lot of cases more popular than superheroes. And it's such a different medium to talk about. So there's just so many different things coming that are affecting these books. The one last thing I wanted to mention, and I wanted to call it out really, really early, because I don't think we can stress this enough. So Jim Shooter joining the Legion in the Silver Age is alternately one of the most bizarre stories of comics ever, but also it's kind of the moment where these books really just go. And everything that we just talked about there not being depth, and they're being very simple. So if you don't know the story, let me just do a really, really quick background. Jim Shooter, at the age of, and I think it's 14,
I believe that's right,
sends in a bunch of sample scripts to DC editor Mort Weisinger and says, hey, I want to write the Legion. Weisinger reads these and says, hey, these are really good, hires him. So now there's a 14, 15-year-old writing the Legion of Superheroes, traveling from, and I believe it's Pittsburgh to New York every weekend to do this work. And I'll be honest, and I hate to admit this because this is a little bit ageist on me. The very first time I read these books, I went in going, these are going to suck. It's a 14-year-old. There's no way these are going to stand up. And I eat crow on this every single time because what ends up happening is you read this and go, holy cow, this is so much better than what had come before. And this
Oh
guy
yeah.
is really bringing new stuff to this book. So I always like to say this, like Jim Shooter is one of those characters in comics who, depending on which interview you hear or who you're talking to, you can get 20 different takes on this guy.
Yeah.
But I will give him the credit he deserves on this. There is no Legion of Superheroes as we know it today without what Jim Shooter did.
That is 100% accurate. I mean, we could have all kinds of discussions about when he returns to the Legion in 2007 or whenever that is. But you're absolutely right. The stories that we have prior to Jim Shooter are, you get a couple really nice gems in here. Oh gosh, I'm blanking on it right now. But more often than not, you get like these silly stories of like, the time trapper turning all the Legionnaires into babies, and odd little things like that. The things that you kind of think of as a '60s comic book plot, right? Kind of these silly little stories that that really don't make any bit of sense, and they're not supposed to. But then when Shooter comes on board and I just checked, he actually started at age 13, which is still even amazing. Um,
Yep.
the stories actually start having depth and consequences and continuity. All these things that uh, didn't really exist or weren't really cared about, I guess, before. From this perspective, I mean, there were some things, right? You had the Lightning Lad with his arm, and then him dying, and already making him come back. So you had some of this here and there. I think before Shooter joined, but overall, there's a definite demarcation between pre-Shooter and post-Shooter.
I honestly think there is and I have no interview. I'm not. This is me just kind of guessing. I'm fairly certain that Shooter came in having read what Marvel was producing, whereas I don't think anybody at DC was reading anything that Marvel was doing in the 60s.
No, I think that's right.
I think he came in and said, let's do this more like Spider-Man or Fantastic Four or whatever. And there's a big shift there. And I do know to a certain degree, like in the 60s, DC viewed Marvel as like, we don't care, we're outselling them. And they were like, this is kind of one of the funniest things about revisionist history as we talk, especially as the Marvel movies are dominating and the DC movies and everybody goes, no, like Doctor Strange was this super important character in the 60s and 70s. And you're like, no, half of these guys, these books weren't selling, like, and they weren't selling anywhere near what the Legion was. Like, if you went back to 1967 and you held up a picture of, say, the Silver Surfer and Lightning Lad, more comic fans will know who Lightning Lad is because his book is selling far greater numbers than anything that Marvel was producing. All right, so I think that's good for the background, and I think that gives everybody a sense of what we're talking about. And look, we're going to jump around a bit. I'll just warn everybody right now because this is a very, very big topic. We have a lot of stuff to say, and we don't want to. So we're going to jump. So as is our style, and I know it's only episode 6, but we've already created a style for this. We're going to talk about what's good, what's bad, what's ugly, which is just a sign of that I'm a fan of Sergio Leone, Clint Eastwood movies. So let's talk about the good to start off with. Let's be positive. When we talk about what's really good in the Silver Age, Jim, what's the first thing that comes to mind?
For the Legion specifically, the first thing that I think about is the fact that you have this very progressive looking group where you have women in charge in positions of authority that are actively and actually effective leaders. I think that's an awesome thing, especially for the late 1950s.
And even into the 60s, like if you compare the average Legion comic where Saturn Girl's making decisions and saying things or telling people what to do, and Shrinking Violet is saving the day in some stories compared to, and I always go back to Invisible Girl, who for most of the Lee Kirby run is just standing around going, I don't know what to do. Reed, help me. There's a big change here. And I would also say as well, like these characters get their own, like they all get their screen time. They all get stuff to do. I mean, even Phantom Girl is an important integral character. Triplicate Girl, she kind of got a little wishy-washy at the end, but for most of the run, she's part of this as much as anybody else. And you didn't see that in a lot of comics. Like, and especially the even numbers. Like, look at the Avengers. There was the Wasp, all guys. And then you go
Yeah.
here, like there's a couple of women in every story. There's always female characters involved, which I think is great. And kind of going with that as well. I mean, another great part of this is it's the teamwork. They're all working together. Like there isn't that they're not bickering with each other. They're not fighting over things. They're both bringing their skills to the table, and we're seeing these characters as a team, as a unit. And I think that was a really great sign, especially when they could have easily gone the other way.
Yep. Yep. Absolutely. How about the establishment of lore? So when we talk about the Legion, right, and we talk about 60 years of history in this comic book, there's a lot of almost specifically Legion tropes that have kind of developed over the time and get retold in some way, shape, or form. And I think the Silver Age is when a lot of this happens, right? So the story of the Legion being formed, that actually doesn't happen until quite a bit later in the Silver Age, but that's part of this. The story, the ever evolving story of how Lightning Lad gets his powers, that ends up including his sister and his brother, and then just more details start to build up on that as they keep on telling it. But things like that, a lot of these core issues, which in some ways can be a double-edged sword, because this establishes a lot of that continuity that future versions kind of go back and mine, either extremely in a very refined, very specific way, or take kind of a variation on a theme to repeat it. So that can cut both ways. But this is where this all begins, and so this is kind of a neat little thing, I think.
Yeah, so I made a little list of everything that was Legion lore related that kind of came out, and it's stunning that in a period of about 3 years, 3.5 years, we get Computo, the Coons, Universo, a Sun Eater, the Dark Circle, Mordru, like, and that's just the villain list that's coming out.
Yeah.
The Fatal Five. It's literally like every couple of issues, boom, here's another big part of Legion, of what's become sort of just the Legion. You talked about like the official Legion origin, the first time they say, and then they're saving RJ Brand, who didn't show up until very long, like very late in this Silver Age run. The origin stories, and we start seeing like this is how Colossal Boy got his powers, and this is how this person got their powers. And I would say the other one as well with the lore. I mean, I think the Legion has always been built on these relationships, like who are friends, who are dating, and you have these couples that are forming that have become almost like sacred in Legion history. Like, okay, it's Ultra Boy and Phantom Girl, and it literally just starts with Phantom Girl going, "Hey, I think he's cute." Well, actually, that's pretty much how all of these relationships start, where the girl goes, "Hey, he's cute," and the guy just goes, "Okay."
Or I love him.
Yeah, like, okay, I guess I'll date her. And that just becomes these, written in stone. These two are together. These two are together. These two are together. It's a lot of what makes the Legion what the Legion is now. And I would say, like, if you're a fan of what Paul Levitz did, especially like Legion Volume 2, Volume 3, if you're a fan of especially 5 years later, because they put this run up on a pedestal, and that's where everything is coming from. And I would say if you're a fan of the Post Zero Hour, where they're going
Yep.
back and they're constantly referencing this, if you want to get an even better sense of like, okay, where are these stories coming from and why are they telling these? And I'll be honest, like I had read all of the Levitt stuff without having a clue what was going on in Silver Age.
Same.
And then to go back and reread it, I was like, oh, that's where that's from. Oh, that's where that's from.
Oh yeah, I'll give you one better. When I started, I started, as I've said before, I've started it in the Post Zero Hour time frame, but then I went back and started collecting the more recent issues, which at that time was the 5 years later stuff. And that, like you said, that version goes directly at specific events in these Silver Age stories and makes them into these like major components of the plot of the overall backstory that get referenced and have effects in the story themselves. And I had no idea about any of this, but you know, I would still read it and enjoy it. So that was the interesting thing, is that they did a decent enough job that if you could, if you didn't necessarily have to know it, but if you didn't know it, you got a lot out of it.
This was my take, and this will be my first hot take of the that's going to piss off anybody who loves the 5 Year Later Legion the best. Levitz, at his best, could pull in the Silver Age stuff, and you knew enough to understand what it was, even if you hadn't read it. 5 years later, pulled it in and didn't give you a hot clue of what it was. So, like, and I'll give you an example. And this was something. So, I think it's like issue 4 or 5 when Mon-El kills the time trapper, and they reference Eltro Gand, who literally is a character who shows up once in one 12-page backup in Action Comics. I remember reading that going, what the crap are they talking about? Like, what is this?
Good point.
And it was, and stuff like that. And they gave you nothing to give you a sense of like what's going on. And that to me was always like one of the big failings of that series. But I say this, like, it's such a kick reading these and going, oh, that's where the Luck Lords came from, or oh, that's where, you know, like that's where the Miracle Machine started, or just, and stuff that would later go on to become really, really, really important. The one thing to remember, and I'm going to pull this little quote out. So we'll talk about this a little bit later, the announcement of the new Legion of Superheroes. And one of the things that they mentioned in the story was how Mark Waid has said that Adventure Comics 369 and 370 are his blueprint for everything that he writes. And I'm paraphrasing a little bit. And for a lot of these Legion writers, and I think Levitz, and I think Waid, and I think Iyer and McCraw, this is their blueprint. Like, these books, and these books are, you know, this lore and how they're putting together the stories and who these characters are. That's where it's all coming from. So it's, I mean, I'm trying to think of another media comparison. I don't know. I guess, you know, like if you're writing Fantastic Four, you're referencing Lee and Kirby all the time. And if you're writing, I'm assuming if you're writing X-Men now, you go back and read the Claremont, Cockrum, Burns issues, and those are kind of your Bible. Like, that's what this is, right? This is essentially the Bible for the Legion.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the reboot Legion took a lot of these stories and kind of more modernized them, I guess, in a way, which was interesting, you know, for me reading this, because as a first time reader reading it, because in the infancy of the online environment of the internet at the time, you'd have a lot of these folks who, you know, were these people who were very familiar with all these old stories and say, oh, this is their take on, you know, this story, like Starfinger, right, is a good example. And when I went back and read that original Starfinger story, and then compared it with the one in 1994, 95, whenever that was, you know, I liked them both. I liked each of them for what they were. I liked the more modern take because it's a little bit more accessible, I think, from a modern reader perspective. You know, but I think without going too far down that road, I think the one of the challenges of that particular era of the Legion was that they tried to mine too heavily on that to do variations of a theme versus just coming up with new stuff.
Yeah, and I think that's been a problem with, again, without getting too far down this, I'd mentioned Three Boot before, and I kind of mentioned, like, I think because a lot of the creative teams for the Legion are so tied to the Silver Age that they can't get out of it. So, like, Three Boot, it's all Silver Age characters. Like, there's nobody from Bronze in that. Like, there's no Wade Kitson version of Dawnstar. Like, it's just, who are the characters that we loved when we were kids? That's all we're going to write. And I think that's kind of a problem. I know we're going off on a tangent and we're trying to be positive here. So let's just go back to the positive of, this is where this all comes from. And this is these creative talents going, right, this is what we're doing. Another thing I wanted to mention when we talk about sort of the good of this run is, you know, we complain a lot about the decompressed stories today. It takes 6 issues to tell you one thing. That is not happening here. Like, these are, I don't think you can quickly reread these. And you know, I'll just admit, like, to get ready for this podcast, I read over a bunch of stuff this week, and I'm flying through things going like, okay, what did I miss? What did I miss? And these are dense Like
Yes,
there's
they
not a
are.
lot of full page spreads during the stories. There's a ton of stuff happening. I think a lot of people would be surprised. Like I always thought that the Computo story was like this multi-issue, gigantic epic. It's two issues.
Yeah, yeah.
And they're like every page, it's a 6 or 8 panel grid of like boom, 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 boom. They do not, they are not slowing down. They are giving you everything that you want in a story. I'm not going to lie. Sometimes they forget what they've written earlier in the story and it's like, and nobody catches it. But you're going to be reading for a while if you're reading this. As simple as these stories are, you're not going anywhere.
Yeah. I mean, to your point from earlier, right? These are guys that they had deadlines to write. You know, they had specific things they had to churn out. You know, I'm sure they were sitting at their typewriter desk. They have, a couple basic plot formulas probably sitting on the wall from an outline perspective, and then just started churning them, right? And that's how people wrote those kind of things back then, whether it was a comic book, whether it's a pulp novel, what you name it. Any of those, like you mentioned before, disposable media kind of things, that's basically how it worked. There wasn't much fancy going on to it. It was just, here's the plots, here's the plot structures, here's the characters, go.
I'm gonna say it's funny that you mentioned that because that actually was into the next category of what's bad. And I did it while I was doing my research. I did a little check into what Mort Weisinger was like and sort of what his story was. And on Wikipedia they actually put this one little bit, and one of his quotes was basically, and I'll actually say the whole quote. People have always accused me of being an egomaniac as an editor because I always gave the writers my own plots. I did that for a reason. If I asked a writer to bring in his own plots and he spent a weekend on 4 of them and I didn't like any of the 4, then he's wasted a whole weekend. Least I could do was to think of a plot for the writer, and if he liked it, I'd never force it down his throat. We'd kick it around and evolve a story. So basically, like, Eisinger's handing these plots out, and this is why, and this will kind of, and this is why, again, it's disposable, but a lot of them end up feeling the same. Like you mentioned before, like the Legionnaires turning into babies or toddlers. I think that's at least 3 times.
Something like
During
that.
this run?
It happens annoyingly too many times. That's for sure.
And then there's the women rising up and fighting the men, and then they find out they've been mind controlled. Like that's twice. Like it's and that's the one thing is there's a lot of recycling of plots. There's a lot of things where you go, okay, this is pretty similar and this is pretty similar.
Yeah.
And I think it is like, and you mentioned also as well, like sort of the rules, like Weisinger had like story rules and Shooter learned all of them. And it was basically when you're writing a comic, you do this, then you do this, then you do this, then you do this.
Right.
So there is a formula there that doesn't break. I could actually argue that the formula is as good and as bad, depending on what's going on. Like having a formula where you're going to make a good comic, I don't know if that's a horrible thing if it's guaranteeing a baseline of quality.
Right.
It's a horrible thing if you're shutting down creativity, but if you're just saying like, at the bare minimum, I need to see this, and it's making the comic better and more readable, I'm okay.
Oh, for sure. And these things evolve over time anyway. I mean, if you go into any television writer's room, you're going to see a similar process today, right?
Or movies, like
or a movie, right? There's here's your number of acts that's going to happen. Here's what's supposed to happen. Here's the big reveal that happens in this act. The climax is in act whatever, and then you have the wrapping up, the denouement of the information of the story, and that's the process. I mean, most of us have learned some form of this in English class or over the course of our lives, right? So they have layers on that, but yeah, they're just there to be able to churn them out. And Weisinger's job was to make sure that happened on time and on schedule.
Yeah, it's kind of funny when you mention movies, like it's even worse than that now. Like they have it set to minutes of like, if this is an action movie, you cannot go more than like 5 minutes between action sequences or whatever it is. Or the movie has to start with an action sequence, especially on like Netflix, because if you start slowly, the audience is gone and the streamers know that, like they've tracked this. And this is kind of the world we're in. So I will say this, if you like the formulas, you might really like these stories because they are very, here's our first 12 pages and this happens and this happens and this happens. And, there's that standard we're going to reveal the story, but we know that by the end you're going to find out that none of this is true and something else is actually happening. And
yeah, no, for sure. And I think from the perspective of, and this is something that just popped into my head as well. I'm also, I've read all of the omnis of the Legion Silver Age stuff. There's three of them, and I also have an omni of Adam Strange for the Silver Age. And granted, maybe it's the part of the fact that I really like the Legion, so I have a vested interest in reading the Silver Age Legion stories, and so I got through them really, pretty effectively. I mean, it didn't take me, maybe it took me a month to go through the three volumes, maybe a little bit more. But I tell you, I'm having a hard time with this Adam Strange one, even though they're science fiction stories of around the same time. I guess the best thing that I can say about the Legion of this time is that even though they do recycle stories, even though they have some silly plots, they are interesting and they have enough dynamic action and storytelling across that time period to make it worth the read. If I go to these Adam Strange stories, I may be a third of the way through the Omni. Every story is literally the same formula, but just with a different villain of the week, basically. And I'm telling you, man, it's a rough read. But the Legion stories, especially like we mentioned, once Judah comes on, they are they really start to rock, and they're fun to read. While we're talking about, again, we're trying to glow it up a little bit here, but there are some things, if you're going into read a Silver Age comic book, especially a Legion Silver Age comic book, that you need to be aware of by today's standards that really, really jumps out. And that's the fact that there are no minorities on this team. It is an all-white team. And there were some
they have green and they have orange and they have blue.
Yeah. Green doesn't really count, but there were two attempts to change this, right? So I guess the two big ones to be aware of here were that Shadowlass, right, was introduced as an actual adult, was her first appearance, but then when she came on, she was Shadowlass, and she is blue skinned basically because they didn't want to make her black. So, which is, again, between Mort Weisinger and just the people running DC Comics at the time, they had a lot of problems. I think they felt threatened that they would lose market share from a sales perspective if they had any minorities on the team from selling these things in the South, selling these comic books in the South of the United States. So, that's not a great look. It's not it's a little bit of a black eye, and honestly, it's something that it's taken the Legion a long time to really distance themselves from. And even you could even make the argument today that they still really have not.
No, I mean, but I could make the same argument about all of DC Comics.
True.
If I really wanted to point fingers and go, DC has always been the more conservative of the two big companies. DC has always been the more, more afraid of change and diversity, which is always really, really weird to me, because I would argue that in the 90s, Vertigo pushed it far more than anything else did. But yet DC was so frightened to follow that. But yeah, especially back in the 60s. I hate to say this, one of the pluses of Marvel, because they're not selling the numbers DC is selling, is they could do more things and they could push more barriers, because they weren't as worried. Black Panther appears, and I don't think I know for a fact DC wouldn't have had the guts to do that, but DC is also selling everywhere, whereas Marvel was a much more sort of niche publication at this time. So they could do that. It's a horrible looking back on it. You mentioned Shadowlass. I know Farrelad as well.
Yep,
was supposed to be a black character too, and the story that Jim Shooter has told is that he killed Farrelad because he wasn't allowed to do that.
He wasn't allowed to have a black character specifically.
Yeah, he wasn't allowed to have a black character, so he just killed. And then he tried to do it again with Shadowlass, and I mean, it is weird seeing Karate Kid as incredibly straight, white guy, and then he's going to Japan for his training, and you're like, really? You couldn't have? But yeah, they weren't doing Asian characters unless the Asian characters were Oh, what's like really
Bad
racist, like the
Yeah,
character in
yeah.
Green Lantern, which was just, ugh.
Well, look at characters like the Coons and in the Legion and the Persuader, right? Those characters were very much designed to, I think, cater to an Asian stereotype, which is, again, not a great look if you're a big company like that these days.
Oh, and the reality of it is, and this is one of the tough things about going back and looking at anything, any mass media from the 60s or before that. I mean, if you're watching movies, if you're watching TV shows, like there's going to be these moments where you just, there's that deep inhalation of like, oh my God, I can't believe they did that. Like,
Yeah,
and yet at the time, like nobody would have raised an eyebrow. Nobody would have cared. It wouldn't have stood out.
yeah.
It wouldn't have shocked anyone.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I mean, it's this is all in context of the times, right? Context is everything, and unfortunately, it's one of in some ways it's very interesting because it's a snapshot at how we were as a society back then. And when you look at it, in some ways, it's not all that great, but that is exactly how things were, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I mean, and we talked about earlier how great it was that they put women into leadership roles, and they're working together, and the women are showing off their powers. But then there's also I mean, I can't count how many episodes there were where some male character was like, I don't want to. Well, I mentioned this too. I think I mentioned this to you before when we weren't recording. Like Brainiac 5 basically saying, I don't want Saturn Girl on the team because she's a girl and this is
Yeah,
going to be dangerous.
yeah,
Or I just finished reading this one. Like it was a duo damsel bouncing boy story. And the whole point of this is they're trying to show these two getting together romantically. And he's just calling her doll the entire story. Hey, doll, what do you think, doll? And you're just like, so
yeah.
for every step forward, there's like 15 steps back where you just,
Yeah,
yeah,
no,
shake your
for
head.
sure. I mean, and it's funny too. So we talked about at the beginning of the conversation, right? We were talking about the fact that DC and comic makers in general had comic books for girls, right? That designed specifically for that market. And yeah, one could argue that the Legion in its very earliest days was something that boys and girls could pick up and read. But then sometime during the Silver Age, like in the 1963, 1964 era, you get a lot of these, what I just like to call girls are icky types of stories. Like there's in I jotted it down here, Adventure 313, The Condemned Legionnaires, which the cover of the story has all of the girls in kind of an isolation tent, kind of like and they all happen to be colored red, right? So I don't know if my wife was a big fan of a book called The Red Tent. I can't remember the author's name off the top of my head. I should have prepped that, but the story was really about I want to say it's biblical times where uh, when women were going through their menstruation cycle, they would essentially isolate them in what they called the red tent, so that all the women going through it at the same time were together. And that's what this kind of reminded me of. It was like, oh, the girls, they have cooties, they put them over there, and all that kind of stuff. And then there's the really infamous one, which was the revolt of the Girl Legionnaires in 1964, where you had Queen Azura was her name, and uh, her squad of feminazis that she led. And I'm just reading this, today in these days, and I'm just thinking back to like right wing radio and all that horrible nonsense that we had to go through.
And as bad as that one was, and I read that one and it just immediately was like, oh, geez. They did it again. Like they did another, like 2 or 3 years later, where all the girls got mind controlled, and then they got their superpowers boosted, and their first response is like, get all the boys out of here, they suck. And like, there's so many parts of this, and here's the worst part about this is that I guarantee you that a lot of women and girls in the 60s would have read this and been offended, like not been shocked or offended. Like it just would have
Yeah.
been, this is,
Yeah.
yeah. Like there was one I remember that really stood out. I think it was the second one where all the female characters are sitting around sewing as they're waiting for a mission to happen, and they're talking about fabric patterns, and the guys are all out, training. And then they said something like, wouldn't it be great if a woman was in charge? And I don't even know which character said it. It was like, but Superboy and Mon-El are the strongest. They have to be in charge. And it's just that,
Ugh.
like, oh, please, like, just, and again, it's so tough to read now. Like, it's
Yeah.
so,
But that all being said, though, I think it's worth it. I think if you're a Legion fan and you have not gone back and read these, you should, because there's way more good than bad. But I think what we wanted to do here is make sure that when you get to the bad, that you're prepped for it.
exactly. Like, you have to know that it's coming. You have to be aware that it's there. And I think that's true. I mean, I can expand this to any media. Like, if you're
Oh yeah.
watching the television show MASH, right? In
Oh
the
yeah. That's
1970s and early 80s.
my favorite, one of my favorite shows ever of all time. Yeah, absolutely.
So let me ask you this. Have you watched the movie recently?
Oh, I've watched, well, not just the movie, which is a completely different animal from the TV show, but just in the TV show, man, that first season, whoo, there is just some horrible stuff in there from the jokes and the the not even covered over racism and sexism that's in there. It's just horrible. Luckily, they kind of
And
figured
the
that
movie's
out by the
worse.
second or
Yeah.
third. And yeah, the movie is even worse in that regard. Absolutely.
But here's the thing, right? Is that the movie is considered one of the most progressive movies of the late 60s because
Right.
it's putting, like there's a woman in a leadership role, and it's very anti-war, and they're showing, they have a black anesthesiologist, but then you watch it and you're like, this is absolutely horrible. And I think as somebody when you're looking back at this stuff, you always have to be aware of okay, this is what was going on, or this is pushing, yeah, this is nasty to watch. Like, this is horrible. And it's true. Even, I don't even think you have to go back to the 60s. Like, you watch some comedies from the early 2000s, and there's stuff in there that you're like, ooh, like it's just wrong. But nobody thought it was a big deal. We didn't know. Like, people weren't smart enough, basically, is what it was. And the culture was different.
Yeah, I guess the moral of the story is, to when you're reading anything of anything older than 10 years, really, probably even more recent in some cases, just go into it knowing when the book was created, because that's going to inform a lot of decisions about, or a lot of understanding about why the creators made certain either dialogue or character choices or things like that.
Yeah, I kind of go with this with the Silver Age stuff. I think don't read anything slightly modern before you go into this. You kind of have to turn your brain into okay, I'm reading Silver Age, so I have to understand that the rules are different and the way they tell stories are different. Things that they do, like, there's so much death in this series, and it's done in
Yeah.
such a nonchalant, nobody cares way. Like Computo killing one of Triplicate Girl's bodies is in volume 2 and volume 3, and I think one of this gigantic character changing moments. When it happens, it's one panel. You'll miss it if you're not paying it. Like, it's literally boom, and then she's dead, and she doesn't respond at all. Like, she's
Yeah.
fine. She's like, okay, there's only two of me. There was a little bit more pathos with Pharaoh Lad dying, but it was only really one issue where, like, the ghost came back and Superboy showed he was a little remorseful, but then it was forgotten and they moved past that.
Yeah.
And I was actually a little bit surprised. Like, the death was handled so just, they died. Okay, next story. Even the Lightning Lad death was, it's kind of like he died and then, all right, we're kind of sad. And then they brought him back and there was no, hey, maybe we should maybe we should deal with this. It just doesn't happen, right? They didn't have it in there. But it was really, like I say, it's interesting to see how they handled this, and interesting to see how they kind of move forward with it. But it's like I say, it's worth checking out. And I was actually going to say, to kind of move into that, I'm going to ask, moving into that, what would you recommend? Like, if you were picking something Like if you said, like if somebody was saying, okay, I'm going to start reading the Silver Age, I don't know where to start or what's something that I would go with, what would be your choice?
I would have to say, just because it makes the adjustment a little bit easier, it'd be any of the shooter stories, generically speaking. And then, but more specifically, I'm actually gonna go with what Mr. Wade says, and give Adventure 369 370 a shot because you get a lot of really good Legion. You get Mordrew, who is one of the classic villain lineup from the Rogues Gallery there, and it's really good stuff. It's fun.
I actually disagree. I really didn't like that Mordor story.
Really, I like anything with Mordrew in it.
So when I read Wade's quote, I was like, really? Like of all the shooter stuff, and my argument is like they don't do anything for most of the story. They're just hiding in Smallville. It's just bonkers. Like there's so many like a mob group literally comes in and takes over Smallville, and I'm reading this going, "Wha-" I would actually say I would pick the Fatal Five story of the
That's a
shooter
good one.
stuff
You
if I was
can't go wrong
gonna.
with Fatal Five.
That would be the one
Yeah.
I would pick. But I get why everybody loves the Mordor one. It just didn't work for me. My recommendation, I was thinking about this, and I think start with Adventure 340 because you're getting the Computo stuff.
Okay.
And then 346 shooter comes in, and then I would run it till about 380. So like those 40 issues would be like the sweet spot. And I think
Okay.
you read it in the omnibus versions. I read it in the archive versions. I think it's archive 5 to 8. Those books. I'll be honest. I think you can skip the early stuff. Like to me, it was one of my complaints about the early stuff was I felt I knew more about the substitute heroes than I knew about the Legion for some of this.
Or the Super Pet.
Yeah, the super pet stories, which I'm just like, okay, I get this is a cool 60s thing, but
Yeah, I mean, well, that's the other thing too. Half of these, a good chunk of these, are just silly, right? I mean, and that's fine.
oh, the other thing you have to get used to if you're going to reread these is kryptonite is literally everywhere. Everybody has kryptonite. Kryptonite is part of everything. At one point, the entire Earth is surrounded by kryptonite dust. Like every issue, that is how they get Superboy to not be able to do everything. It's just
Yeah.
kryptonite, kryptonite, kryptonite.
I was just going to mention here, based on what we're talking about here, I just had a kind of a thought from the breakdown of these stories. If you wanted to pick up any of the omnis, right? So you're talking about picking up the archives. If you're going to pick up the omnis and read this, read Omni number 2 because I think that is the same kind of that has that same range, right? It starts uh, before things go kicking in with shooter, but you still get some good stuff of that late pre-shooter era that has a lot of it's more developed Silver Age capabilities, but it really starts, getting into some of the cool stuff like Computo, like Universo, right? I mean, you have the whole, surprise, mysterious story is in here, which is also that's kind of a personal favorite. So
Yeah,
that's
I really like
probably
that
what I
one
would
as well.
recommend.
Yeah.
It's just volume 2 of the Omni. If you,
I'm glad you mentioned it. I think the universal stuff is great. I mean, even though I knew what the mystery was because I know the whole thing, I thought that was really well done. And
yeah,
like I said, there's stories in here that, again, this comes with the caveat of these are Silver Age stories. You're reading them with that kind of slant in mind. There's some really, really good stuff in here, really entertaining stuff, even with all that taken into account. The last Legion Silver Age story I was going to ask is this. What is your favorite bonkers insane part of the Silver Age?
okay, well, there's two. I'm going to kind of cheat here. So there's two things. The first of all is the Miracle Machine, right? So that's always because it's kind of a nice little Deus Ex Machina plot device, but it's kind of fun and it plays roles in other things in the future that are kind of neat too. But I think I know where you're going with this. But the other thing is the Planetary Chance Machine, which was the device that they used to pick who the leader was of any particular mission. And why don't you go ahead and tell us how it worked?
Okay, I was actually teeing this up for you, but I'm glad to talk about this because we've talked about this before, and I love this. So, in one of the early issues, they were trying to decide who who's going to be the leader of the team and who's going to be on the team. And they did it completely random by chance. So they have this essentially a machine that has all the planets of our universe, and they start spinning around, and then the planets fly off, and whoever they hit in the head is part of the team. And the first person that gets hit is the leader. And I'm reading this and I'm like, oh, how much scotch were these guys drinking when they came up with this? Like, it's beautiful because it's just so crazy. And that's the thing. And that's the other one I will say, like, there is so much craziness in these books that are like, so one of my favorites is there's one story where, and I'm sorry, I'm blanking on who the villains were. They're going to destroy the 7 wonders of the 30th century. And one of the wonders is the reverse waterfall, where they've literally built a machine at the bottom of a waterfall to push the water back up and make the river go back the opposite way. And I'm reading this going like, this is the dumbest thing that I've ever seen, but yet it's awesomely stupid. And like those kind of things I just love, like these crazy, or they all have flight rings, but we're going to build them flying cars for them to drive around in to go into battle. So they're in these little red, they look almost like the kind of things you'd be riding on a those spinny rides at like an amusement park, the teacups, like where they look like those, but they're flying into battle in these. And then as soon as one gets blown up, the Legionnaires like, okay, I'm going to fly. And why do you have this? It's
so the story that you're talking about here, this is actually the original Starfinger story. So it's Adventure 335. So yeah, so this is, again, I actually really enjoy this story a good bit, because it's just fun. I always thought it was fun, kind of neat. But yeah, I think it's all a little bit crazy. And I think, you said they were drinking too much scotch. Personally, I think that they had some kind of a drinking game like that use something like that to spin and hit them. So if you get hit, you take a shot. And I think they just incorporated it into the game. That's my personal theory. I don't know if that actually happened, but it sounds true, and that's what's important.
Yeah, I like that one. It's just I sit there and I go like, somebody had to think this up. And it's funny, like when you read like the 70s comics, especially the 70s Marvel comics, it's like, okay, what recreational pharmaceutical did they take before they did this? And
my God.
60 Silver Age, there's a lot of like, okay, how much were they drinking before they wrote this story? And it's kind of what makes it awesome.
Well, let's kind of wrap it in here. So I know we're again going a lot longer than we ever thought we would, but that's what you get with this podcast. But we wanted to end with a couple things. So first of all, there was some actual Legion news this weekend. So I guess it was last week for us when we recorded. But the last episode, we were talking about how would we like to see the Legion come back in the future. And we mentioned that there's this absolute Omega Legion that Darkseid controls that we're going to see soon. But we got some interesting news this weekend.
So the big exciting news is at a convention, I believe, Mark Waid announced there's going to be a new Legion series. He said, we're sure that everybody's going to love it. I think some people are reading into what he said. They don't think he's actually going to be writing it. But regardless, like, this is exciting news. The last time the Legion was published in a series was that epically amazing Justice League versus Legion series, which people have told me, like, I want to burn my copies of. So I think people are quite happy to hear this news. So I've mentioned this before when we talk about the new series. I am very cautiously optimistic, so I'm hoping for the best. After reading your reviews of Justice League United, Unlimited, sorry.
No, it's United. It's United.
Sorry, I am kind of hoping Jeff Lemire is the name of the writer, but let's see what DC does.
Yeah.
Just fingers crossed it works. And I hope that it's funny, like we talked all about the Silver Age. My hope for this series, and you've said the same thing in multiple places, is that they don't just worship the Silver Age. They pull Legionnaires from everywhere. I want to see a Legion where you've got Wildfire working with Excess. I want to see, like characters like Kinetics show up with block. Like to me, that's that you've got to have everybody. It can't just be all right. We've got we've got Ultra Boy and we've got Lightning Lad. We've got to have them from every incarnation. Well, we don't need Earthman, but I mean everybody else we want to see.
Yeah. So specifically, so this was at WonderCon this past weekend, and uh, so this is I'm assuming this is a transcription from a so he did a 50 answers in well, I'm sorry, it's 50 answers in 50 minutes panel was what he did. So I'm not sure if this is an exact transcript or not, but it says this is an official synopsis, but we'll see. But what is specifically said here, the question was favorite version of the Legion of Superheroes, and the answer is Jim Shooter and Kurt Swan. Right? It's kind of what we were talking about. Wade knows who is taking the reins now for the Legion, and he has confidence in them. There should be news in the next few months. So, more information to come, it looks like. And
I'm excited.
Here's another one. Here's another question that hasn't been talked about so much online that I've seen. The other Legion question that's on here says, how do you feel about the last 15 years of Legion? He likes what Bendis did and things after he took on the team. That's okay, whatever. And then the specific quote that is here is, ask me that question in a year because I'll have a much better answer. So that's very interesting. So we'll have to see how that turns out.
All right. And I believe we got another email.
We did. Mr. Martin Gray emailed us again, responding to episode 4. So thanks, Martin. And he had another great comment, as he does. So Martin says, another great episode. Thanks, gents. Imra is really fascinating, isn't she? Yes, she is. And you're right. Saturn Girl would always do what she thinks is the best for others, even when it probably wasn't. A nice one on spotting the commonality with Dream Girl. She also doesn't mind being disliked for doing what she thinks is for the best. Emphasis on thanks. Both of these amazing ladies might try sharing their fears once in a while, seeing if someone else doesn't have a better idea. Imra historically doesn't even share things with her husband Garth. For all their great qualities, are Saturn Girl and Dream Girl horrible egotists? What do you think, Jay?
Well, I don't think you can argue that Dream Girl is not a narcissist.
That's for sure.
I think if you're the leader of the Legion of Superheroes and you put your name up and said, I'm going to be a part of this, you have to be a bit of an egotist. So I'm going to agree with all that, but I'm going to say the same thing about everybody. Like if you're going to tell 24 other people, do this, do this, do this, there has to be a part of you that's like, yeah, I know what I'm doing.
Yeah. And there's definitely a bit of ego for leadership for sure. Absolutely.
No, I mean, I think of like the most egotistical Legionnaire, which I think you could say is probably Wildfire, and that's what he brought to the table when he was a leader. So I think that's part of it. I think as well, I'm happy to see both of them not second guess themselves. I think that's a good sign of a character as well. Like they're sure of what they do, even if they might be wrong. And in a lot of cases, I mean, for everybody's been wrong in the leadership role. So it's good. It's a good question. It's a good thing to talk about. In talking about Saturn Girl's leadership style, we could have spent another half an hour when we were doing those Saturn Girl episodes. So it's all part of the fun. And that actually leads into, we're going to keep talking about Legion leaders next week, next episode, because next episode is Spotlight on Cosmic Boy. So we are going to give Cosmic Boy the full treatment. We're going to talk about him. We're going to talk about his background. We're going to talk about him as a leader, because as we know, according to 3Boot, Cosmic Boy is the greatest leader in all history and of all time. So we will dive deep into Rock Kryn.
That'll be fun.
Yep, that'll be good. All right, Jim, where can people find you online?
All right. Well, I have my Legion Reviews website at jimboslegion.blogspot.com, where I try to post one new comic a week that is somehow Legion related. This past week, I did issue 5 of 6 of Justice League United's Infinitus Saga, which had guest starred the Legion of Superheroes, which was kind of cool. And you can find me personally online at Blue Sky at jimbofett.bsky.social, Reddit at jimbofett87, and on Discord as jimbofett on the Legion fan club server. How about you, Jay?
Oh, I am. So if you want to find the articles that I write, the reviews, they are at jmlonglivethelegion.blogspot.com. I'm currently working my way through 3Boot. So I'm the first third. If you want to find me online, you can find me at Blue Sky at jmckiernan.bsky.social. You can find me on Discord at at Drake Burrows, and you can find me at Reddit as Drake Burrows as well, which lets everybody know my favorite superhero. Also, if you want to reach out to the podcast, we have an email address, which is how we got that great email we just talked about. It is longlivethelegion2025@gmail.com.
And you can also follow us at longlivethelegion.bsky.social.
Perfect. So we have all of these places. I had one more request. If you are enjoying this podcast, if you are loving it, and if you have not subscribed yet on whatever platform you're on, whether it's, I think most of our listeners actually come from Apple, whether it's Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whatever, if you could click that subscribe button, that actually really helps us out. And it lets you know when all of our content is coming out, although we are coming out every second Saturday morning, or I think it's Saturday morning on the East Coast as well. So, but a little subscription button helps us too. Otherwise, we are done. We will see everybody in 2 weeks. Like I say, read up on your Cosmic Boy comics and we will talk about that. So for everyone, long live the Legion.
Long live the Legion.